Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Anitra Nelson and Terry Leahy, and we'll be talking about degrowth in Australia. But before we begin, I'd just like to share screen and tell you a little bit about Earth Laws Month and do an acknowledgement of country. And just a cheerful reminder, if everyone could stay on mute, that would be lovely. I'll be trying to keep an eye on any background noise, but it's great if you could do that too. So my name's Michelle Maloney. I'm the co-founder and national convener of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, and I'm also one of the many people who has co-created the New Economy Network Australia. Today's webinar is part of this glorious and slightly crazy, something like 35 online events throughout September to celebrate humanity's relationship with the living world across a whole range of different disciplines. If you don't know anything about AILA, I'll give you a quick blurb in a minute, but if you're interested in seeing this wonderful program of mostly free webinars from amazing people, please have a look at earthlaws.org.au/ELM 2022. This week, Nina and Ayla have been working together to co-host a week of webinars called Economics for the Earth. The New Economy Network Australia is delighted to be promoting thinking about economics from the point of view of how do we support the rest of the living world, not just humanity, and not just a small proportion of humanity, but all of humanity. And today, as I mentioned, we've got Anitra Nelson and Terry Leahy. And our format today will be two talks, one from Anitra and then from Terry, and then we'll open up for Q&A. As is the tradition now in Zoom land, any questions you have can be popped into the chat throughout and I'll collect them. But before all of that happens, I'd like to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the traditional lands of the Yagara Turrbal peoples here in North Brisbane. I invite you to have a think about where you live and whose country you live on. I'd like to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging of the Yagara Turrbal peoples here in my beautiful home, and invite you to have a think about where you put your feet in the soil and the plants and the animals around you, and to honour and respect the ancient civilizational culture that continues today, the first peoples of Australia. Ayla and Nina are actively involved in conversations about decolonising our hearts and minds. So I also like to acknowledge my place, which is a descendant of the Irish folks who were very reluctant to come over, forced over, and the part that my ancestors have played, I guess, in the settlement/invasion of the continent. Certainly the work that we're all involved in is how we can move into a future where we care for country, care for each other, respect and honour First Peoples, and become good Earth citizens. And again, another tradition in Zoom is if you want to drop in the chat where you are, whose country you're on today. It's always lovely to see where you folks are from. Please feel free to use the chat as a place to chat with others if you see good ideas or if you've got a recommendation or whatever. The Australian Earth Laws Alliance, if you don't know anything about us, we were created by a group of lawyers. We're now 10 years old this year, and one thing we are doing in Earth Laws Month is having a very small online and in-house birthday party for Ayla later in this month. So if you're an Aylarite and you're a member or a keen supporter, please do join us online or in person in Brisbane. We're very, very interested in and have been working towards advocating for people to think about, learn about and get more involved in the practical implementation of Earth-centred systems change. And we look across law, economics, education, Indigenous knowledge, ethics, the arts, a whole bunch of pretty groovy interdisciplinary stuff. One of the organisations that Ayla has played a role in catalysing is the New Economy Network Australia, or NENA, which is now an incorporated cooperative with thousands of people connecting in and many hundreds of beautiful members. And Nina's role is really to be a platform for engaging people in big conversations about the economy, in finding alternatives and new ways forward in this place in Australia, supporting core ideas such as working in solidarity with First Peoples, localisation, place-based economic support for the rest of the living world, and social and economic justice. And again, if you're new to Nina, please do look us up. We've got a pretty awesome space and lots of people coming together across different hubs, sharing info, updates, finding each other, networking, sharing. We've got Housing Week coming up in early November. We've got a co-ops series of webinars at the end in the first week of October. And we also work and hold the space for wellbeing economics. So back to our week, and my advertisement is nearly over, so I can finally get to our guest speakers. But on Monday, we had a fantastic webinar about population, consumption and climate change. The recording for that will be available shortly. Yesterday, had a big yarn with Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute, which was really brilliant, really kind of pulling apart and deconstructing what an economy is and how we can really build whatever we want, so long as we do the work and build the change. So that was excellent. And again, all of these have been recorded. Tomorrow, we have a session on the wellbeing economy, and particularly because the federal government is giving at least some initial lip service to a wellbeing economy. What does that mean? What's it all about? And I'll be grilling people on, well, does it mean anything different for how we care for the environment? And I must recommend tomorrow night, in keeping with the ideas around degrowth, but also sharing some Indigenous perspectives. And the title here, I give full credit to Mary Graham. We decided to call it, instead of great expectations, medium expectations. How can we reduce our demands on the living world? How can we find cultural and societal responses to the challenges that climate change is going to bring to affluent societies? And how do we demand a bit less, but have a little more in terms of quality of life? So I'm really looking forward to that yarn tomorrow night with my two dear friends. Anyway, I could go on and on because I'm so excited about our month of lovely activities, but now it's my great delight to introduce Anitra and Terry. Finally, let me just quickly refer to their bios. So Anitra Nelson is an activist scholar affiliated with the Informal Urbanism Research Hub at the University of Melbourne in Australia. And Anitra has written several books and many articles about degrowth. If you booked through Humanitics, you'll have seen the list of her excellent publications, all of which have been coming out only in the last 18 months, 2 years. Obviously, she has a body of work before that, but some of these: Exploring Degrowth, a critical guide with Vincent Leagy, Food for Degrowth, Perspectives and Practices, and Housing for Degrowth. So I'm really excited to be able to catch up with Anitra again and hear about her thinking, her work, her research and projects that she's involved in. And Terry Leahy recently retired and is now a conjoint at the School of Humanities and Social Science at the University of Newcastle. Terry does research in social theory, the global environmental crisis, and food security for Africa. Taken as a whole, he says his work is related to the project of non-market socialism and the gift economy. So I'm really delighted to be able to listen to you lovely folks today and share your talks with everybody else. So we might unspotlight us and hand over to you, Anitra. Thanks so much for joining us, and look forward to what you have to share with us.
Great, many thanks, Michelle, for inviting us to participate in this session in the Earth Laws Month. So to begin with, what is degrowth? This is often a confusing word, especially for people who first come to it. But I often say, instead of thinking about the D in degrowth as in decline or decrease, think about decommodification, deconstruct, demilitarize, and decolonialize. Because what degrowth is it's a kind of political and philosophical as well as social approach to transforming ourselves away from growth economies and to build an economy instead that's based on the way that everyone's basic needs could be met and how we could do that within the limits of Earth. So we're really looking at probably a whole range of different kinds of economic ideas and concepts that will be explored in the Earth Laws Month, but there are some unique ways in which the degrowth movement present their approach. One way of thinking about growth and degrowth is, rather than seeing growth at one end of the spectrum and degrowth at the other end of the spectrum as if it were austerity or depression, is to think about degrowth as being about quality, whereas growth is about quantity. So why are people advocating for it? Well, many people now identify gross domestic product growth as an approach wrong-headed for our national economies, and recognise that it's a simple monetary total and it's quite irrelevant to people's quality of life and Earth's regenerative capacity. The idea of degrowth is probably about 50 years old, but in actual fact, the movement really only got off the ground and became very visible earlier this century in France, and then spread to Europe, and is now being absorbed more in North America and Australia. So it's part of an anti-capitalist, decolonising and anti-globalisation thrust, so lots of alliances with other 21st century movements. It's an economic analysis that strategically gets to the heart of why capitalism doesn't work for people and how we need to respect Earth's limits, because rising carbon emissions have just been a symptom of the underlying human activities which are despoiling the Earth in a whole variety of much deeper ways. And probably one of the ways that I'd say that degrowth is unique with respect to other alternative economic models and futures is its philosophical approach. It's multidimensional, and politics is at the very heart of degrowth change. So it's very much about political autonomy, substantive democracy from the ground up, relocalizing democracy, as well as economies. So it's not just about an alternative economic model, it's about a whole different approach to living and life. It's very pointed in terms of ethics. For instance, I've got here this book, The Imperial Mode of Living, which is the way that a lot of global north degrowthers see ourselves as sort of being forced to live in an imperial mode of living. And degrowth, as I said before, is very connected to other degrowth, to other movements, and it's very horizontal in its organisation, its structure, its interlinked networks and nodes. So what Terry and I are going to do today is to really look at Australian degrowth initiatives in a worldwide context. Degrowth initiatives in Australia centre on activities of activists and activist scholars who research and write a lot about degrowth initiatives. And this doesn't mean marginalisation, but rather intervening in political, economic and cultural fields. So a really practical example of a degrowth advocate is Tammy Jonas. Tammy is president of the Australian Sovereignty Alliance, and she and her partner are small-scale free-range pig farmers in central Victoria. Now, you might have seen her because she was on an ABC Four Corners program about 3 or 4 months ago. It was an expose on corporate food monopoly JBS. Tammy and her partner apply degrowth approaches in their farm and their meatsmith enterprise to save land, work time and money by using all and every pig in more and more ways. They also feed their pigs damaged or surplus food, such as dairy and grain products that would otherwise be wasted. In other words, they use fewer pigs for greater output, and they minimise waste pollution and landfill. So a few minutes ago, I popped into chat some useful URLs for you. One of them was my own site where, as Michelle referred to, I've written or edited 3 books with other people on degrowth. And I've got pages on my website which refer you to not just more information about those books, but also to media blogs, which you can freely read. Also, I've put in the URL for the Degrowth network. The Degrowth network, as I emphasized, is sort of very decentralized and horizontal, and that hub, degrowth.info, is really the basic structure of the entire movement. And I've also popped in Tammy Jonas's website. Now, Sabrina Chakori, who you can find on Facebook and LinkedIn, and she's written for The Conversation. She's the founder of the Brisbane Tool Library, based at the State Library of Queensland. She's a CSIRO researcher. She's a fellow of the Post-Growth Institute in Portugal and one of the founding editors of the New Degrowth Journal. And so if you live in or around Brisbane, Sabrina is a key contact for you to learn more about degrowth and degrowth initiatives there. She's often held talks with different people and a whole range of activities. There's a University of Melbourne academic, Samuel Alexander, who's a degrowth advocate, and he and Brendan Gleeson wrote a book called Degrowth in the Suburbs, showing how to apply permaculture principles for urban living within Earth's limits. Now, I'll leave Terry to actually talk more about that topic. Suffice to say that Sydney-based Ted Trainer, who advocates what he calls the simpler way, also refers a lot to degrowth in his writing. But he's actually fairly critical. Like many steady state economy advocates, they are working in the same direction as degrowth, but they often argue that their approaches are superior. One point I'd like to make in that respect is that degrowth has a vision, its own vision, with lots of aspects and synergies with simpler way and steady state economy advocates. But arguably, as I emphasized before, it's sort of uniquely political in its sort of localized and horizontal democratic models. And that's probably something you just become more aware of if you become involved as an activist in the movement itself. Two of the international collections that I've co-edited is Housing for Degrowth and Food for Degrowth. And Housing for Degrowth includes a fantastic chapter by Ted Trainer talking about his Pig Face Point house at a demonstration site that he's used for educational purposes for decades, illustrating simple ways of building and living to achieve massive energy and material efficiencies. That collection also includes a really interesting chapter by a Canberran architect and a Ni Vanuatu housing expert, showing how traditional grassroots democracy and local economies saved housing in the case of Cyclone Pam on the islands that comprise Vanuatu. And I have a chapter in that collection that's on eco-collaborative living in two Victorian examples. One, an environmentally focused housing cooperative, both showing how living together, as in co-housing, eco-villages, and political squats, achieves ecological efficiencies and sustainability. There are also articles on degrowth in both of the last two quarterly editions of Green Agenda. And again, I've popped the URL for one of those articles into the chat. This journal is aligned with the Australian Greens Party, and the most recent one argues the compatibility of degrowth with the Greens approach. For instance, the Green candidate in my electorate campaigned hard, highlighting the Greens policy to build 1 million affordable homes, arguing for free education and wiping out university student debts, taxing billionaires, and for grassroots democracy. And these policies align well with degrowth values of enhancing quality of life for all and reducing inequities. I add there that the Greens housing policy is advanced because they actually acknowledge and promote co-housing, eco-villages, ways of sharing housing, as, you know, more than sort of just simply developing a whole lot of big spreading suburbs. Similarly, decolonisation and degrowth are strong themes of the Warurak initiatives that have been developed in my local Mount Alexander Shire Council after they've announced their climate emergency. And I co-wrote the article on degrowth with the co-author of Exploring Degrowth, and it speaks to his activities in Budapest, where he's involved with a social formation called Cargonomia that centres on degrowth, and it involves cyclonomia, which is a do-it-yourself bike repair, plus cargo bike manufacturing enterprise in the middle of Budapest that they use to ferry goods from a small farm that they have outside Budapest into households that are in Budapest. So it's partly also a community-supported agriculture. And that Cargonomia has a kind of social centre in the middle of Budapest. So it's a kind of like a whole conglomerate of different kinds of degrowth activities, and they partner with council. So it's a particularly good example of the kinds of degrowth activities that demonstrate degrowth and enable people to be degrowth activists. And I'll just finally quickly talk about the Food for Degrowth collection. I co-edited that with another Australian, Ferne Edwards, although Ferne has actually worked overseas for the last decade, and her area is alternative food networks. A lot of the degrowth activities that I'm aware of centre around setting up alternative food systems, from farming organically using more traditionally and environmentally friendly methods like Tammy does, through to community supported agriculture networks, to preserving and distributing food in more inclusive as well as sustainable ways. There's a chapter on how an Australian household is economised on money, as well as efficiently using their living environment to support them. Some of you might know Artist's Family. They're probably best known through their book, The Art of Free Travel. And there's actually a video of their chapter at their site. In Food for Degrowth, one of the final chapters is actually by Terry Leahy. He wrote a chapter there on, it was really a kind of thought experiment on whether permaculture could feed Melbourne. So this is my prompt to pass you over to Terry.
Well, I'll begin then. I probably won't talk about that chapter so much at the moment, except to say that I thought there were certain problems in feeding a city with like Melbourne, with the kind of resources of open space, even if you dig up lots of roads and so on, and that maybe what we needed was more ruralization. Well, that would certainly be in sync with the views of permaculture, which I'm going to talk about. What I wanted to orient this talk around is this idea. In Europe, my impression is that degrowth is the thing that people talk about who have a certain set of ideas, which Anitra has explained to you. Whereas in Australia, and to some extent in the UK and the United States, the term that people are using and the concepts that they're using are derived from the idea of permaculture, which was an Australian invention. And it interested me to hear the way Anitra described degrowth just then, because everything that she said about what degrowth means and so on, I can find either in the Canon of Permaculture, the key books of the permaculture movement, or in the statements by interviewees from the permaculture movement. I've recently completed a book on the permaculture movement, and the talk I'm going to do now covers some of the research I did from that. So I'm going to start off by talking about the sort of central ideas of the Canon of Permaculture, which was basically in 3 books, and I'll just add a 4th probably to that. The first one is called Permaculture 1. It was written by Bill Mollison and David Holmgren and published in 1978. And it was like just after the first set of oil shocks. And so the emphasis in the book is really on energy depletion. So for example, so the industrial system is based on cheap energy sources. The energy now needed to produce these crops far exceeds the calorific return from them. The energy does not come from the sun via photosynthesis, as in pre-industrial times, but mostly from fossil fuels via the industrial systems. As Odom demonstrates, the high yields of today are not due to efficient or even sustainable methods, but due to a high external set energy subsidy. And then here's the kicker. The reduction or collapse of the energy subsidy will result in a catastrophic drop in production. The basis for support of even pre-industrial populations at low standards of living would not exist. So what they're saying is that current agricultural systems feed lots of people, but that they're based on a shallow premise, which is that the cheap energy from fossil fuels, and that we're about to see the energy depletion of this. And Permaculture 1 was addressed to the sort of back to the land countercultural movement, people buying rural properties and trying to set up self-sufficiency. So it's basically saying to them, you're the pioneers of what will be required by the whole world in a situation of this catastrophic drop in energy provision. And in terms of tactics, what they're saying is that by people provisioning themselves directly for food outside of the cash economy, then the effect is degrowth in effect, in the sense that we're pulling out a large part of the cash economy out of the cash economy and provisioning it directly through subsistence. They imply the possibility of ruralization. We believe it is socially and ecologically desirable for all regions to be self-sufficient in food and for all people to have some contact with the process of food production. And then what they recommend as a tactic for people is voluntary simplicity, which so what they talk about is reduction of dependence on the wider industrial system can be taken a long way, reducing the need for people to work in the industrial society and consume its products. So the strategy is really a strategy of grassroots change. It's addressed to a particular fragment of the population who are open to these ideas rather than to making a huge social change. There's no mention of climate change in this first book, and there's very few mentions of renewables. The kind of talk about renewables that they talk about is the use of biomass and burning wood and so on like that, and using alcohol instead of petrol to fuel some transport. By 1988, the classic book by Bill Mollison came out, The Designer's Manual. And in the Designer's Manual, what's emphasized is the idea of permaculture as permanent agriculture. So the aim is to get to a stable, sustainable system of agricultural production. What Mollison also does in the introduction is open it up to the possibility that permaculture is not just about agriculture, but about other systems to fulfill human needs. The other introduction, if you like, in this second book, and it's a really important introduction, is the sense of an ethics of permaculture. And basically these ethics are care of the earth, care of other people, and to distribute the surplus. In this particular book, the third ethic is written as setting limits to population and consumption. By governing our own needs, we can set resources aside to further the above principles, mainly care of the earth and care of people. And so what the implication of that is that we're destroying other species on the planet. We're reducing biodiversity by over-consuming, and that what we need to do is rein in this consumption to give more space to other species. So, and this is also an ethics which has implications for personal lifestyles. Responsible conservationists have gardens which support their food needs and are working to reduce their own energy needs to a modest consumption, or that which can be supplied by local wind, water, forest, or solar power resources. And there's in terms of politics, the strategy is very much, and this is really central to the permaculture movement, a grassroots networking strategy of the social movement, not a strategy of aiming to change structures of government or to engage in a political process. He says, we should cease to look to power structures, hierarchical systems, or governments to help us, and devise ways to help ourselves. Thus, the very first strategies we need are those that put our own house in order, and at the same time do not give credibility to distant power-centered or unethical systems. And what I'd say from my interviews with more, you know, in the last few years with permaculture people is that this kind of strategy is contested at the moment. It's not that people are going, permaculture people are going away completely from this idea, but what they're suggesting is we need to do more. We need to attack political power structures and work towards system change. What we also find in this second book is a mention at the end of the book, really, about climate change and fossil fuels in relationship to climate change. We don't find it as what we find centrally in the book. Again, is the emphasis on oil peak and the end of fossil fuels, that the fact that we're running out of them. And it implies degrowth in things like this. We need to develop a conservative societies. With this conservation achieved by close attention to recycling, the avoidance of waste, and to very durable technologies so that their use is prolonged. Okay, so now the book which has had a massive influence on permaculture movement is David Holmgren's book, Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, which was in 2002. And why the book's called Beyond Sustainability is that David says that we're in a process of energy descent, and this will take up to 250 years. So it's ridiculous to think of permaculture people as creating a sustainable society right here, right now. Instead, we're on a process of adaptation to energy descent, and true sustainability will only be reached in like 250 years' time. What's also implied in that is that permaculture people now are inevitably involved in using technologies and resources, if you like, that have manufactured resources that have been created through fossil fuels, and making use of the work of Odom. David even goes so far as to say that the high-tech, high education kind of technologies that we use now will not be actually able to be maintained, that they're really dependent on fossil fuels in ways that Odom, this other theorist, explains, and David doesn't really go into in a great amount of detail. But so what we can see from this is almost like a ratcheting up of the idea of where we're headed in terms of degrowth. We're headed for something, and he says quite directly, more like pre-industrial systems. He says, yeah. The limitation of this concept of sustainable culture is that it suggests some stable state that we might arrive at sometime soon by applying permaculture principles, a future in which much smaller human populations are in balance with their renewable resource base, maybe hundreds of years ahead. And it's interesting to look at how he treats solar panels. He basically thinks that solar panels are not energy efficient, in the sense more energy goes into producing them than they can produce than you get out of them. And this is not just based upon a normal calculation of energy, but it's based upon the idea that the high tech, the high education, the sort of communications technology which we have now is responsible for this possibility. And he says, nevertheless, in 200 years' time, the primacy of trees is likely to be entrenched, while solar cells may be one of the forgotten high technologies of the past that there is no way to manufacture. So this is a fairly extreme degrowth perspective. Now, what I want to talk about now is the interviewees. Okay, so what I wanted to say about the interviewees, and like a lot of these people are in Australia, is that much of the ideas that are contained in this canon is reflected in the interviewees. For example, they want to live a simpler lifestyle themselves. Often they'll define permaculture in terms of not wasting and reducing one's impact on the world so that other species can flourish. So that kind of ethical assumption is there. What they'll often talk about too is their own attempts to embody the grassroots strategy, like say one person involved is in a cooperative community village, another one's involved in a community supported agricultural farm, another one is helping suburban people to redesign their backyards in a way that produces food so they're not so dependent on the industrial food system and so on. And what they also emphasize through this is that this has had certain costs in terms of not making a lot of money, and in some cases they've jumped out of this particular lifestyle into one that they think is going to be more secure financially. But that doesn't mean that they regret their involvement in this. They think that was the right thing to be doing, and they appreciate this. So they're attempting to pull themselves out of the cash economy to a certain extent. And we even find this in the third world interviewees, like say the interviewees from the EDEP organization in Bali, and what they're doing. So they're particularly interested in forests, where wild forests in Indonesia that are still like going strong in that situation and preventing people from being taken over by the timber industry, destroying their forests and so on. So what they're saying to them is, one, grow, sustain yourselves by producing food for subsistence so that you are not so dependent on the cash economy. Like that's point one. And point two, do some sort of ecological niche market of some product or other, which is going to provide that little bit of extra cash that you need after you've made that first prior decision. So again, what we find is an attempt to sort of disengage to a certain extent from the cash economy. So I'll probably have to finish in a minute. So I think what I'm going to mention is two interviewees from the UK, Jasmine and Andy Goldring. And what I found particularly interesting about them is that they talk about, and other interviewees talked about this, an organization called Control Shift in the UK, which brings together different people, including permaculture, to try and create a system change. And what it's particularly interesting in terms of degrowth is that both of these interviewees use the term degrowth. So Jasmine goes, and specifically, we've got this thing going over here called Control Shift, which is a bit like a degrowth thing, really. It's got 100 organizations which are all trying to affect social change at a grassroots level. And then describing the group, she says, there were trillions of groups, but a lot of them were they were social things like mental health projects, a lot of things for marginalized groups to have a voice, a lot to do with food, the transition towns groups. The thing that they've got in common is that they're all committed to social and ecological values being given priority over profit. And then in that sense, they are degrowth groups, really. So, and then Andy Goldring does the same thing. He talks about, I can't find the quote, but anyway, I'll talk about the other interesting thing is Andy Goldring talks about that Kate Raworth's donut economics. And so he says the inner ring of the donut is like our foundation, which is our foundation needs as human beings, which could be broadly described as a sustainable development goal. So no one living in absolute poverty. People have access to fresh water. People have access to a fair democracy and so on. So these are human needs. So that, again, this is really similar to the degrowth perspective, that we need to reduce our consumption of the Earth's resources and look after other species through that and live a much simpler life. And he says also we need to design the economy in a way that it doesn't have to grow, so it can be much more steady state and so on. So I'll finish up with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. That was an excellent overview, and one of our audience members has said it's been a wonderful overview of the permaculture principles, and it helps her put things together in her mind, and I have to agree with that. I'm just going to spotlight Anitra and myself. There we go, so that we can have a proper chat. I've got a couple of questions collected already, but folks, if you do have any more, please write them down in the chat, and I'll make sure that we get to them in the order that they come in. It's the only semblance of distributive justice I can find. So before I go into their questions, I wonder if you could clarify a couple of questions from me as someone who, within NINA, we kind of feel like we sit as a platform exploring all the different ideas that are out there and trying to support people sharing ideas and progressing their projects. Anitra, I think you and I have mentioned this before, but can you explain a little bit about some of the different views that folks in the steady state economy might have for degrowth? Some of the ideas I've heard is that degrowth is a way to deliberately contract economic and human activity so that we can live within a realm of, whether you think about it as living within the donut or steady state economics, that we can't degrow forever. It's a way to get to some point of steady state economics. But what are your thoughts on this? What are the distinctions between, I think you mentioned folks like Ted Trainer and the Simpler Way. You know, can you talk a bit more about those differences?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, number one, degrowth is not just, it's not in a sense about contraction. It's only about contraction for those people who are already living in over-modest ways, who are not just satisfying their basic needs, but fit very much into a growth and capitalist mold of money making more money, and money being the basis of their security. So degrowth, the way that we would like to characterize degrowth is think about satisfying everyone's basic needs, no more, no less. Okay, so make the bar satisfying people's basic needs. And therefore, what is actually happening is, yes, certainly there's going to be contraction of certain people in terms of what they consume, but it's getting all those other people up to what would be having nutritional food and proper shelter and all those kinds of things. But the other aspect is that there's a way in which a lot of steady state economists say degrowth is a strategy of getting to a steady state economy. So, and a lot of degrowth activists and advocates object to that because they see themselves as having their own vision, and it's not necessarily consistent with a steady state economy. So some of the differences between a steady state economy vision and a degrowth vision are very political. And I would say that this would also differentiate degrowth from permaculture as well. So degrowth is quite has quite a strong European model of political autonomy. It's also shared with a lot of global South countries, of strong autonomy of local economies, and so they're anti-politics in the way that permaculture is, but they're very political in a way that I don't find permaculture as political. So yeah, degrowth, for degrowth, deliberative democracy and moving towards owning and controlling economies is really key and really very important. The steady state economists tend to envisage an economy which is quite highly, as I see it, bureaucratized, or has got a lot of administrative staff, and it's all very kind of like scientifically worked out how much we can do this, that, and the other. In the socialist angle, you know, Terry mentioned non-market socialism. There's a lot of people I find similar to steady state in that area talking about cyber socialism. They're not non-market socialists, but they're socialists, modern young socialists who are using a lot of nerdy kind of ways, a planned economy. Degrowth is not, it's just not organized top down like that. It's very bottom up, and it's all about much more indigenous, many more synergies with indigenous ways of organizing society.
Thanks, Anitra. I do remember Sam Alexander, who I spoke to and invited to this session, actually, but he's off working on some other projects at the moment and sends his greetings. But I do remember some of Sam's writing saying that it was more anarchical and not in the real version of the word, not chaos, but
in the positive way.
Yeah, not the state-centered, highly controlled. So that's very useful. So you're saying in the work that you guys look at and your angles or framing of degrowth, it's less about state-centered control and responses and more about society embracing these other principles and demanding less or wanting less and using less. So that's very interesting. That is quite different to how some people talk about degrowth. So thank you for clarifying that. There were a number of questions in private comments to me about permaculture and its influence on degrowth. And I'll just ask this question, then I'll go to the other questions from everybody else. But I don't know if Terry, it might be best for you. Can you, in simple terms, just explain today what influence you think the permaculture movement has on the emergence of degrowth in Australia? So you've talked about these origins very well. Is this still a common influence between the two? Because in some of the folks I've heard talk about permaculture, they've never mentioned degrowth. So is this still like a lively interaction in the theories?
I think it's happening more in the European and UK permaculture movement than it is in Australia. It's not so much that it's just I think permaculture people, and I think this is influenced by the various canonic books like David Holmgren's writing and so on, think we invented this, so why should we change the name? You know, like, in other words, they don't see permaculture as distinct from degrowth, but they're not going to use the name degrowth just because it's been used in France. You know, why should we use that word? You know, like, it's a bit of nationalism going on there, I think. Whereas I think in Europe and the UK, what's happening is that permaculture people are involved politically in networks with people who claim to be degrowth, and basically they've had to acknowledge, and they do acknowledge in their conversation, in their talk, you know, in the words that they're using, that permaculture is a degrowth movement. I mean, I think in terms of Anitra's characterizations just then, it's like, I think there's a difference between the canonic literature and what permaculture people are saying who are members of the movement. I mean, there's a lot of critique from within the movement of the people that I interviewed, a critique of the apolitical character of the classic permaculture books and the sort of strategy of doing it ourselves and not worrying about power structures and so on. And heaps of the people that I interviewed are massively critical of that orientation and think that permaculture has to get away from that. You know, there, like, for example, a woman in Wales, CSA, going, a lot of permaculture people think permaculture is about all having our own little farms and working for ourselves. I find that a completely ridiculous idea. It's just crazy. And we need to be engaged with other political movements to get system change. And Andy Goldring is saying, and he's the leader of the Permaculture Association in the UK, and he's going, Yeah, that's right. We can see that fossil fuels are destroying the world, but there's 10 companies around the world whose executives think this is a good thing for making profits. And until we get power, we're not going to be able to defeat that. We need to get power we need to achieve political power to make the changes that we need. So I think there's a shift happening in the permaculture movement in terms of those kind of issues.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. And I guess for some of us inside the NINA network, the things to be aware of are different ideas about not just the definitions of these ideas, but their origins and their future direction. And to delve a little deeper into their meaning and possibilities. All right, so there's a great question here from, I think it's Neil. I'm just going back to the beginnings of everyone else's questions. Does degrowth include depopulation?
It's very controversial, and so most degrowth people will just say that population is not a central issue, and they will just argue that because there are a lot of people who are over consuming, and it's not just consumption, it's like there's massive production and waste as well as overconsumption. That I think that there's a sense that the figures are still out as to whether you could of what the globe could actually sustain in terms of a population. And the idea about everyone localizing their own economies and making sure that people's basic needs are met, that would be the way of actually working out what kind of population the world is able to sustain. The Great Transition Initiative recently had a great big debate about this, and it's worth going onto the site there. The whole population, depopulation, whatever debate it just tends to be incredibly sort of divisive. And
No, thank you for that. And I'll dig up the great.
Can I say something about that?
Please.
Yeah, okay. So within permaculture, Mollison says we need to reduce population in the basic designer's manual book. And then David Holmgren drop it from the ethics by the time of the 2002 book. But David does make a comment on it. He says that we have too many people to be sustainable. But population will reduce if given the economic security for women, that women have control over their own reproduction, and infant mortality rates are low. And also, of course, he makes the same point that Anitra's just made, that the problem is rich people using much too much of the world's resources, and we need less rich people, less behavior of that type. So, yeah, I mean, the permaculture movement is probably a lot more. We'll see how that goes, but I mean, they've done the same thing as basically removing that as one of their key ethical principles. But at the same time, I wouldn't say it's completely absent by any means. And the most important thing about it is that Holmgren, following Odom, believes that we're going to get down to lower populations inevitably as an effect of energy descent. That actually the huge population of the world now is premised on cheap fossil fuel energy. I mean, I don't know if I believe any of that, but it's like that's a key idea floating around in the permaculture movement.
Thank you. And I was just going to say, if I get a moment later, I'll dig up the Great Transition website, or if someone else online wants to pop it in the chat, it's a great site. And I do want to plug the conversation that Ian Lowe, Hayden Washington, and Jane O'Sullivan had on Monday night as part of this week's series. It was a really good conversation about the divisive and difficult issues around population consumption. But it was a terrific conversation because we laid bare many of the issues. We had some discussion about that. So if folks are interested in those issues, please backtrack and watch the recording for that when it's available. It's a nice way to hear some Aussies, men and women, talking about these issues. So there's another good question here from Petra, and she's asked, does the transition towns movement intersect with degrowth, and to what extent, I think you've touched on this a lot, Anitra, but to what extent does political activism feature in degrowth activities?
Well, the majority of degrowth activists work at a grassroots level. So it's the politics of horizontal, decentralized activity, and I think that in many ways degrowth is quite unique in this extent. So you've got your post-growth institutes that are aligned or non-government organisations, that they're in universities or non-government organisations, but they in no way represent the whole movement or anything like that at all. So degrowth is held together by international conferences that are held every 2 years, and a range of other kind of conferences and gatherings, you know. So it's very much a politics from below. Also, I mean, I do think, you know, both of you, particularly Michelle, you've mentioned this. I think this is worth raising, is this book here. It's called Degrowth in Movements. Okay, so what, out of the 2016 Degrowth Conference, which was in Budapest, these three people edited this collection. They actually targeted people in other movements, such as permaculture, but in a range of other movements, including a movement, a non-market movement that I'm involved with, but I'm just looking at it here: climate justice, care revolution, care work, basic income, the union movement, eco-villages, a whole series. Okay, and what they did was a really interesting exercise. They asked the people in the other movements to say, what are the synergies between your movement and our movement? How could we work together? What are the differences? Yeah, differences can be very constructive. There's no kind of, you know, like, yeah. So what I get is a really, really strong sense from many 21st century movements that are arguing for justice, social movements, and environmental movements, is the possibilities for connections that we have, the possibilities for us actually all collectively imagining a vision for the movements, which is a more unified one, is very strong.
Thank you, is what I said, Anitra. And I love that idea of that body of work, kind of connecting different movements. I know a lot of folks in Australia are looking across that as well. There's a couple of questions here. There's some comments about energy, which I might come back to, because there's a series of questions connected to the idea of what happens to the building sector and those kinds of sectors with a degrowth view. So there's a couple of different.
Yeah, I read down that.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that, Anitra?
I think it was answered in the chat. And that is very much our Housing for Degrowth book is about self-building, about sharing, about retrofitting. Those are some really, really key kind of angles. So, for instance, we've got chapters on Christiania in Copenhagen, Freetown, where people squatted a big old disused military barracks. And I mean, they retrofitted that for housing. And then they, in certain areas of the land, some people built their own housing. And they did it all through recycled goods and that kind of thing. And the very interesting aspect about Christiania is no one owned any of that. So if you go to Christiania, and you'll go into a neighbourhood and you'll be allotted some housing according to your need. And when you leave, even if you've built, you know, in the process of living there, you've built a house, you go with nothing, okay? Yeah.
And yeah, I'm just looking, there are other comments in here about and I think that these discussions around if we degrow or reach a sort of a lower level of consumption, what happens to all the different businesses? Well, you know, businesses change, and Richard Dennis was talking about this too. Instead of building new things, we'll be repairing a lot of stuff. You know, the idea of bringing back repair cafes is being heralded as some kind of revolution. The idea that big corporates allow the construction or the making of products that are planned obsolescence victims, and then it's almost illegal for some folks to then try to repair them. There's a whole bunch of intellectual property, you know, all of these ideas are being addressed around repair cafes and maker spaces. And I know that they're connected to the localization stuff. So for those folks that have been asking about what happens to building, what happens to construction, well, I guess it's the same as, you know, how we've, as Richard Dennis was saying, it's a great example how we moved from taking photos into the photo lab and waiting a week for blurry photos on a piece of paper to moving to digital. A lot of the housing issues will change completely in our lifetime because of the needs to move away from all of this unaffordable housing, and also the retrofitting and construction. But I do think, excuse me, there's some great questions there. And the work of folks, as you mentioned, Anitra, like Sabrina, who've got the tool library, the sharing of objects and things and tools. I think that's pretty cool too. Just excuse me, folks, I'm very sorry. I'm recovering from being unwell, and I think I'm about to cough a great deal, so I'll better put a question to you very quickly. Pam's asked, how do we pull our activities together to become an effective alternative to capitalism? Everyone I know is really busy, but not feeling like they're being heard amongst the clamour of the market. Although this recent election certainly has shown that change is possible. Did you want to talk to that, Anitra and Terry, while I cough in an embarrassing fashion? Excuse me.
Yeah, Anitra, do you want to go first?
Oh, well, yeah. I think that it's a massive problem. I think it's probably the biggest issue facing all of these different kind of movements I was just kind of discussing. The kind of the view that that I've developed is that we actually cannot get where we want to go. That is, have social equity, being satisfying everyone's basic needs and living within Earth's limits, actually without we can't do it with the market, and we can't do it with the state. So I've actually just written a book called Beyond Money, a Post-Capitalist Strategy. So I definitely believe that we need to go beyond capitalism. But, you know, there are lots of people who within the degrowth movement that would not represent everyone in the degrowth movement. There are a lot of people in the degrowth movement who are skeptical about money. And I think that the strong feeling is that we need to be as vocal as possible in confronting capitalism with its very real limits and weaknesses, because it's not satisfying everyone's basic needs as a system, and because there's an internal dynamic, just the whole approach of a dynamic of competition will automatically lead to inequity. So that's a massive problem for most people. Maybe you could take over, Terry.
Yeah, well,
it's a very big problem. I'm just trying to work out how to make.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of things about this. The first thing is that the different sections of the left, or of people who would like to see system change, disagree on quite fundamental issues. You know, like the difference between the sort of steady state economy theory and non-market socialism, or the gift economy, or anarchists and socialists, democratic socialists, and you know, permaculture people, or whatever. These are really important differences, and they're sort of unresolved. I mean, ideally, I think we'd have much more chance of winning system change if we had some sort of consensus on that. And like Anitra, I would like to see a consensus around the idea of replacing the market with a non-monetary economy. But clearly we're not in that situation at the moment. And what I'd also say is that I completely would agree with Anitra that grassroots networking of various kinds and across different political ideologies is important. I mean, if you look at an organization like Ceres, the sustainability organization in Melbourne, or you know, you find probably people with a variety of different perspectives, and that's okay, because they're working on some common projects, which is things like educating high school children about sustainable technologies and stuff like that, or working in India on a sustainable housing project. I mean, it's like there are things that people can do that network together where it's not necessary to have a complete consensus about some of the more fundamental issues. And I think we're doing that, and that's what we should be continuing to be doing. And I do think it's effective. And in my book, you know, the politics of permaculture, I look at how permaculture as an organization, as a movement, works through networking of grassroots and semi-autonomous sort of units, setting up things, creating things on their own turf, and kind of then linking up with other groups. And I think that that works, and it's working throughout society, not just in the permaculture movement, but more generally.
I think we're at a very experimental stage where a lot of people agree that we're not democratic enough, but that doesn't necessarily mean going beyond the state. But for other people, it does mean going beyond the state. People feel like there's something dreadful things wrong with the economy, but which, you know, particular model we follow and how far we have to go beyond capitalism or whatever is, again, a big issue. And it's really good because a lot of people are experimenting, like Cargonomia in Budapest. A lot of people are doing a lot of different things. And, you know, I myself have experimented a lot in more eco-villages, communal living and that kind of thing, and found a lot of, from my point of view, a lot of kind of answers in that direction. Yeah.
Thanks, Anitra and Terry. There's a couple of different conversations going in through the chat, and they're very interesting. I'm just going to try and pick up on questions, but for folks who are interested, please, at the end of this, copy the chat, because as folks have been sharing links and references and other books, as well as Anitra shares her links too. Walter's asked a good question about what might degrowth do to medical research. I'm the grateful recipient of several medical and surgical procedures that didn't exist 30 years ago. And it's a great issue about, you know, this mix of technology will save us, we will grow our way out of this problem, versus, well, actually, do we make sensible choices, prioritize health, but not have quite so many plastic toys from China, but have plastic bits and pieces to save ourselves? But what do you guys think?
I think, look, what it raises from a degrowth point of view is the whole issue of technology. In degrowth, there's a concept of convivial technology, which comes from convivial tools. Ivan Illich wrote a book about this decades and decades ago. Convivial technology is technology that the community themselves has decided is most appropriate for whatever aim that they have for that technology. It needs to be as efficient as possible in terms of ecology, in terms of using as little of Earth's energy and materials as possible. It may not be the most efficient in terms of social time, but it will be the ways that people feel most comfortable making or doing or servicing, okay? User-friendly technology, technology that people can actually understand the basic principles on which it works, so that they could make or repair it. So these are all the things that contribute to what convivial technology is. Okay, we get back to people's health care. Well, a lot of people are following preventative principles. They're doing alternative medical kinds of approaches. And I think probably the area, because there are a lot of problems and a lot of people are very critical of drugs in the conventional medical system. Surgery is probably the most outstanding way in which Western medicine has provided a unique space for itself. And the degrowth approach to all of this is that, as with, and there was a good question, what are basic needs? The community itself has to, within the ethics of how much you use of earth and how people themselves use their own labor, have to work out how far they go and what technologies they develop or put aside, which technological routes they take. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to say something on that. I think it's really hard to get with these technological debates, because in a sense, the answer to the question, is this particular technology sustainable, is one we don't have. And we can't possibly have in the context of a global capitalist economy, which is concerned with making a profit. And so it's very hard to tell whether a particular technology is sustainable. And the other thing I'd say about it is to sort of amplify what Anitra's just been saying, and say that in the context of a non-market economy, collectives of producers would be making decisions about what to make, how to make it, and to whom it would be distributed. And whereas within a market economy, firms have an incentive to maximize profitability even at the expense of environmental costs, in the context of a non-market economy, a collective of producers has to worry about what their community will think of them doing something which is maybe going to damage the environment that the community lives in. Also, if they're producing things to provide for some medical technology for some other community, they have to think of all of the communities around them who are going to say that what you're doing is actually causing pollution problems or toxic waste problems or overusing energy or something like that. They have to take these things into account, and they would be happy to take these things into account. Their status and prestige as producers of people who are doing a useful service would depend upon making environmentally sensible decisions. You know, in the context of a market economy, that kind of decision-making process is impossible. If we have a non-market economy, we can move to a situation where these technological questions get resolved as producers collectives and the communities in which they're embedded are considering these issues and making decisions based on these other factors.
I was going to say, it brings to mind many of the discussions and debates we've had inside NINA, and the framing of market, state, and the commons. And I think, you know, degrowth is all about trying to make sure that people share the commons without being too ideological about what the state and the markets do or don't do. Whereas in the steady state mode, there's a much stronger role for the state to support the ecological health and the limits. So it's very interesting. And in fact, I do want to come back to some other points folks have made, but Michelle Smith's asked a question that I think links nicely to what Terry was just saying. Can we have a market economy with regulations and incentives to protect nature? Now, that question assumes that we can only have one or the other, but this is the point. Governments and human beings as collectives can construct any system of governance they want to have. Anitra, do you want to talk a bit about, perhaps reflecting back from what I just said, this idea of we have governments theoretically elected by people, state-controlled laws, but even the market itself is set up by some kind of constraints and some kind of structure. And then the commons are the area that people are arguing we have to have more sharing and more caring. So Michelle, yes, we can, but Anitra, did you want to talk a bit more about the role of markets, government and such in the ideas around degrowth?
Yeah, well, I think that the most degrowth activists and advocates are they're keen to see different ways that you could use the current system to degrow. And for instance, to encourage regulators to allow more self-building, allow more repair cafes, you know, so that people could be experimenting more with this kind of thing. But in terms of actual kind of moving forward, there's much more of a politics from below, horizontalism, all of that kind of thing. The market is, I would say that the state, in terms of degrowth, although there's an attraction to find policies that are compatible with degrowth, there's a stronger movement probably just ignoring the state completely. Whereas the market is more problematic, and some people think that you can make the market do what you want it to do, and that we've always had markets, and that there is, however, a growing movement against the market and the non-monetary one, because as people are experimenting more, they're actually finding the very real problems with it. The very real problems include the fact that monetary values are really about human beings coming together and bargaining between one another. It's completely anthropocentric. That it in no way relates to any objective efficiency whatsoever. It's just what people are thinking. And so there are massive problems in terms of the market, from my point of view in particular, because monetary values are a completely different system from social values and ethics, and from ecological values and ethics. And there's enough complications with human beings trying to work out how we can respect the earth while maintaining sustenance and doing what we want on earth, without having this other complete complex overlay. The other thing about the market is that although markets have existed, they've existed in extremely marginal ways. And it's only been over the last 500 years, and again, right from the first few of those centuries, markets were still very marginal to most people on Earth's livelihoods. So that the historical kind of the reading that markets are presenting a massive problem is similar to the reading that capitalism is a massive problem.
Which many of us would agree is largely correct. Yes, Terry.
Yeah, my comment on all of this is, I agree with what Anitra's been saying on this. I mean, I think the answer to the question, in a market, can we get the state to regulate, to control environmental impact in the context of the market economy? I mean, obviously, in a way, the answer to that must be yes. I mean, we have national parks. That's an attempt by the state to control environmental impact in the context of a market economy. The question is really comes down to whether we can deal with the kind of environmental problems we have now with this huge environmental crisis by regulating a market economy. And that's where I'm skeptical. I mean, I basically think the regulations that we would need to deal with the environmental crisis that we have, including massive degrowth and things like that, would cause all sorts of problems, which would be both political and economic problems, which would make a market economy impossible. For example, we probably would end up with galloping unemployment. If we try to deal with that with the UBI kind of solution, but apart from the question of where is that UBI money going to come from, the other question is, if you pay people a UBI that's actually comfortable to live on, and you need to do that to deal with the political problems of galloping unemployment, then you end up with a situation where there's no motive to engage in alienated labour, to be ordered around by a boss, to be part of the monetary economy anymore, and then the whole market economy starts to fall apart. Similarly, if you put various kinds of regulations on environmental impact on people who are investors, who are capitalists and so on, and they just go, well, this is ridiculous, I'm not making much of a profit, I'll just hang on to the money that I've got and have, you know, snow ski trips to Sweden or Switzerland or whatever, and not invest my money, you know, like why invest under those conditions? And so you also have the problems of capital flight. If you do it in one country, you end up with capital flight, and your economy collapses relative to other economies. Then there's the massive bureaucratic overkill that would be required to deal with the myriad environmental and social problems that we've got. I mean, what we've got at the moment is a bit of tinkering with the market economy, which maybe is feasible. But if we try and actually deal with all of these problems, we have a massive unpredictability of prices. We have huge overly bureaucratic organizations which we can't actually fund or control, and they don't actually work and so on. I just don't think it's really feasible. So I actually
what
think
is feasible, Terry?
a non-market
that's a very
economy is
gloomy.
much
Yeah,
more feasible.
thank you. I just didn't want anyone to sort of leave this conversation feeling like they wanted to give up.
No, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So certainly what we talked about a bit the other day with Richard Dennis, someone asked a question about offsets. And even he said, you know, people are just gaming the market. He said, we just need to decrease carbon emissions. We don't need to play around and swap. We don't need to have this or that, or this person have more and this person have less. That's a market response. Or if we can just trade it and then cap it. It's like, no, they're gaming the system. They just want to keep doing what they've always done.
On the ABC last night, they actually had some people who are in the offset game themselves, saying that everyone
doesn't work. Yes. Yeah, Richard mentioned it yesterday. I was pleasantly shocked. I hadn't heard of it. So look it up, folks, on ABC and News. I'm going to as well. That the people in the gas industry were coming out and saying these offsets aren't working, and the regulator was going, "Well, yes, they are," and the industry folks are going, "No, they're not. Like, we're getting more credits than we're actually reducing." So all of that might sound really confusing, but can I just suggest for our audience who are like me, not economists, it comes down to some very simple choices. Human beings are clever enough to make decisions as a group. If we see Australia as a group of human beings, and this is again what Anitra and Terry, and certainly what Richard Dennis was talking about, we have the power now to think about the future we want and to just make the choices, you know, instead of this gaming, this endless corporate interests controlling the agenda. And I'm not saying it's easy to do this, but the decision comes down to, no, I don't want marketplaces to be confusing and bamboozling. I just want less carbon coming out of my world. And one of the best ways to do it is to just say no more fossil fuels, no more new expansion, find other ways to do things. And I sort of slightly disagree with Terry's argument about the UBI. I think if we had to, as a transition, pay people while they looked for another job, and I've heard folks, you know, in Newcastle talk about how BHP of all groups paid them for 2 years to find another job when they were shutting down industries, and how it worked well. They went off, retrained, and are now doing things they're interested in. I think there are ways to do a costing of what's it going to cost to shut this industry down, and how do we pay people to go and find another wonderful life. You know, there used to be a whaling industry in Queensland. There isn't now. Everyone who killed whales must have gone off and found another job. You know, things get closed down, things get stopped. How do we move into these different modes? But that's just my little rant, facilitator's privilege, I suppose. But look, I think we're starting to wrap up now, and the chat has been really wonderful in this discussion. I urge you all to copy that chat, because we've had people talking about population and the issues around that, and how to think and find more research on that. Housing issues and what degrowth looks like in the medical spaces, intentional communities. Folks have been chatting about money. And I just want to mention, Mark has said here, town planning rebellion calls for change in the way we do planning and development as part of a transition to a degrowth society. And that's terrific to know, Mark. AILA is about to launch its citizens' inquiry into Australia's planning laws. And we're bringing in lawyers. Wow. And I know, and I want to mention it to everyone. If anyone's interested in like sending us stuff we should include, or being an expert witness or a local community witness, we are going to basically spend a year and a half gathering stories from everyone about how the planning system doesn't work and the bits where it does work, and really advocating for something different, because we find governments are less likely to do the things that civil society folks and researchers want to do, which is question unlimited growth. And so what we want to do as lawyers, or some of us are lawyers, is exactly, and that's why I'm excited to see that town planning rebellion group, which I've heard of, but I must connect with. So if anyone's interested in challenging the entire way that decisions are made in this bloody country about some of those things, let's do it together. And I've got a student group who've been researching planning laws all from every single jurisdiction in Australia, and lots of environmental groups lined up to tell stories. Yes, Anitra?
Co-housing Australia. I was on the planning working group, Co-housing Australia. Like, it is so hard to just get a different form of housing where people are sharing their dwellings and this, that, and the other. It's just like, it's almost impossible. And those few people who manage to establish something nearly kill themselves and spend about a decade, several of them, doing that, which is just ridiculous.
Yes.
That's a very good example, and those people would be able to give you lots of.
That's great. We're actually working with Co-housing Australia for Housing Week for Nina. So yeah. Anyway, that's a pet project of mine that I'm excited to see. There's these deep connections into the degrowth movement. So I think we can pretty much wrap it up now. I know there's a lot more comments and questions and discussion. It's fantastic. This is exactly what Nina is hoping to stimulate, are these discussions. And if you're left today with more questions than answers, great. Please look them up, connect, send emails, harass Anitra and Terry for more info. Join Nina, get involved with Nina, talk up the economy, because it's all of us. We make the damn economy every day. Let's make it to be a little better in what we need, or a lot better. So enough of my slightly strepsil infected now. I'm on the lozenges so that I can still speak. I would like to send a huge thank you out to our audience. Thank you so much for being with us today. And if you're listening to the recording, thanks for joining us as well. And an extra special thank you to Anitra and Terry. And thank you for all your amazing work, in the past that's brought you to us today. Can't wait to read some of your books and stay in touch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, lovelies. And don't forget, we've got another awesome webinar. We've got 2 terrific ones tomorrow, one on wellbeing economics, and I'm going to cheerfully grill the wellbeing economy folks as to, well, what does it actually mean for the environment when you've got these indices and the environment's one of the many? It's like, no, environment is primary. How do we fit the wellbeing economy inside our ecological limits? And then tomorrow night, the wonderful discussion with Mary Graham and Ross about our medium expectations, which I think fits nicely after our degrowth talk today. So thank you again, everyone, and hope to see you around the traps online and in person soon. Thank you, Anitra. Thanks, Terry.